This is Dan Schneider. On this Dan Schneider video interview, the subject is Mission Impossible, the original television show from the 1960s. I'll be talking with Mitch Hadley about it, and the conversation will begin in a moment. The subject is the original television show Mission Impossible from the 1960s. Mitchell Hadley joins me again to talk about this show. Welcome, Mitch. For those who've never seen you before on this venue, could you give a little background about who you are, what you do, and your intro to Mission Impossible?
Sure, it's good to be with you again, Dan. I have the website itsabouttv.com where I write about classic television and its relationship to American pop culture. I'm also the author of this fine book, The Electronic Mirror, which talks about who we were and who we are and everything in between, and how classic television can tell us more about our own history. And the history that we're talking about today is Mission Impossible. It is a mission I have chosen to accept, and we'll see how successful that decision was at the end of the show. But Mission Impossible was a terrific show on CBS, ran from 1966 to 1973, 7 seasons, 172 episodes. It was a highly acclaimed critical success during its time, very popular for most of its run. And in essence, you can think of it as a caper type of show, perhaps something like The Sting, perhaps something like Leverage if you're thinking into the more recent TV past. But it is a show about a special force of agents called the Impossible Missions Force. Their job, as directed by the government, is to get involved in conflicts that are part of the American national or international interest. We could be talking about foreign governments, we could be talking about the syndicate at home, but their job is to get the goods on the bad guys, to solve a problem that's potentially embarrassing or difficult for the government, to do it in very ingenious and clever ways, and that's the show's hook, and to do it in such a way that none of it will get traced back to the government, because as we are told every week, if you or any member of your team is caught or killed, the secretary will disavow any knowledge of your existence.
So, the IMF was like a lot of shows that had agencies in them. We mentioned the last time we spoke about Hawaii Five-O's 5-0 Force. There was the man from the Uncle was United Nations something or other. Then there was I Spy. Well, they might have were they FBI? I don't recall. But we also had like a Secret Agent or Danger Man with Patrick
Mm-hmm.
McGowan from The Prisoner. He was, I think MI5 was the real British thing. He was
Yeah.
MI6 or something reversed like
Yeah,
that.
he was
So
actually with the UN for the first year,
yeah,
and then after that, I think you were correct in assuming that.
yeah, and so this was another sort of agency that was sort of, I guess you'd be calling them black ops today, especially with the
Hmm.
accept the mission or not. What was the source for the show? Where did it come from? And how did it differ, let's say, from some of the shows I've just mentioned?
The creator, the mastermind behind Mission Impossible, was a man named Bruce Geller, and you recognize his name probably for a number of other shows that he was working on at the time. He was the creator of the private detective series Mannix, which started 1 season after Mission Impossible, and it also had a very successful run. And Bruce Geller's original idea was to have a group of, shall we say, misfits, people who had been trained in some kind of a special ops organization to do something and to do it very well, to do the dirty work. And the premise was, in the original concept, the premise was that they had become, if not outlaws, people who were no longer suited to live in ordinary uh, company. And they were brought into this special IMF in order to be able to make use of those talents, the original head of the Mission Impossible force, the original mission leader, who was played by Stephen Hill, his name in the series is Dan Briggs. And again, originally the concept was that Briggs felt he owed it to these people because he had, in a way, programmed them, he'd made them into what they were, and he felt that it was really his duty to find a way to be able to use their skills and talents productively. Otherwise, they would be involved in a life of crime, if not worse. Now, as the series progressed through the development phase and finally getting up into the pilot, Geller modified that idea so that they were no longer a group of misfits. Instead, they were people who worked for the government but had regular jobs that gave them skills that would be useful. So they're full-time professions, as it were. They were actors, models, electronics experts, doctors, but they had special skills that when called upon, they would apply in particular missions. Now again, Geller's original concept was that you would have maybe 2 or 3 regulars, and then you would have a rotating group of guest stars that would appear throughout the season to give it the appearance that every week the mission leader, Briggs, was putting together a different group of agents that were particularly suited to whatever assignment that they were going to have. But for various reasons that we'll probably get into, that also kind of went by the by to the point where you had a regular cast of 5 people in addition to Briggs. Most of them would show up in every episode, but there were usually at least 2 or 3 involved in each one. And they might from time to time add a special guest star who would be there to provide a particularly specialized type of knowledge. But otherwise, you settled fairly quickly into this core group of agents, this team that would work on these special missions. And from there on in, that's essentially the premise of the show.
As opposed to Hawaii Five-0, which was well known for filming on locations in Hawaii, as I recall, the early years of Mission Impossible was more in studio. They didn't do as much out in the real world, but I think as the turnover in the cast, I think by the time Leonard Nimoy came on later in the series, they were doing a bit more outside shooting.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, it's interesting to think about it that way because these the scams, the stings that the group would set up usually involved them creating some kind of replica of a set or of a room. So in a way, the lack of location shooting actually works out well because what you wind up with is seeing them create the set that they're going to work on during the course of the mission. So that worked out pretty well. Ironically, as the series progresses and as it shifts more from overseas international intrigue to where the group is fighting against organized crime, the scenes become more domestic in nature, and therefore they're able to do more location filming than they would have done if they were filming overseas. So it's an interesting way of thinking about it, but as the episodes get more homegrown, the opportunities to be able to do location shooting actually multiply.
Yeah, and like a lot of shows of that era, like the aforementioned Secret Agent, and I think also with The Man from U.N.C.L.E., there was also a lot of fictitious countries. Anything in Latin America, you just put 2 Spanish words together and it's a country.
Yep. In Eastern Europe, for example, an umlaut and the letter Z thrown in somewhere into the word always worked well. That was called, I think, Gellerese or some modification on Bruce Geller's last name, that they created this fictitious language that would be easily recognizable to the viewers, but also would telegraph to them what part of the world they were supposed to be in. For example, they would spell gas G-A-S, A-Z, and they put an umlaut over the A so that it looked suitably Eastern European.
Yeah. So let's before we talk about the main cast and how it changed over the years. Just like with Hawaii Five-O, Mission Impossible had one of the great theme songs of all time. It starts out with the do 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 do. And it really was catchy. Did I was that song also the theme song also a hit the way Hawaii Five-O's was?
Yeah, perhaps not quite as big of a hit, but it was. It was written by Lalo Schifrin, who also wrote the theme to Mannix, and he also did one of the arrangements for the theme on The Man from U.N.C.L.E. But it produced a very successful best of album that contained music from the first couple of seasons of the series. So it was very popular, and it set the tone for the entire series in a couple of ways. One, you had the opening sequence, which would show images from the upcoming episode against this backdrop of this fuse that kept getting shorter and shorter. So time was of the essence. You saw what was going to be going on in the episode, but not enough of it that would give away the story. And at the same time, it created this sense of action and urgency, that there was just a lot of movement to it. And so it was really an ideal opening set for the show. But in addition, Schifrin did a lot of the music, as I said, for the first couple of seasons, and the important thing about that was that Mission Impossible was not a dialogue-heavy show. Most of it, or much of it, was watching the plan being assembled and put into place, seeing the agents, whether they were sneaking through air vents or setting up something behind the backs of guards, or working somewhere in the sewers or the utilities. There was always the suspense about whether or not they were going to get caught, whether or not something was going to go wrong, and there was no dialogue for those scenes. So it became imperative that you had music that was going to ramp up the tension, create the atmosphere, put the viewer on edge. And so I think that's why, more than many series, the music is so important to Mission Impossible, and it plays such a positive role in creating the atmosphere.
I've always thought, and especially thinking of the song, I always thought of the Roadrunner cartoons and that the IMF was sort of like a competent Wile E. Coyote.
That's a great way of looking at it, right? But they don't get their gadgets from Acme, so everything always works well. They get it from Collier's Electronics.
So the IMF force reputedly or purportedly was an independent agency and whatnot. Do we ever find out anything about the structure above the squad leader, which was first, like you said, Ken Hill was the first guy, and then Peter Graves replaced him in season 2?
Season 2.
And so, is this? Do we know if this is part? Are they military? Are they intelligence? Or are they a combination of both?
We don't know. The only thing we do know for sure is this cryptic reference to the secretary at the beginning of each episode, when the mission leader receives his tape-recorded instructions, and they always say that the secretary will disavow any knowledge of your actions. We don't know who the secretary is. We assume that he is a secretary of a department, as opposed to, say, being literally a secretary of an office. But I think that there's one vague reference to a Department 5 or a Department S or something like that. But otherwise, there's never any explanation as to whether they are on the payroll or whether they're freelancers or what part of the government they work in. We only know that they work in both domestic and international situations.
Now, this was the era of episodic television. I'm sure there probably was one or two parters, but things didn't carry over from episode to episode. So how did they explain in season 2 the switch from the leadership from Hill to Graves?
They didn't. That simple way, they didn't. And this was, if anything, it was a good series to be able to do something like that, because there's always the risk, the element of danger in these. So you could always assume that Dan Briggs had been killed, or that something had happened to him, that he was no longer part of the group. There's also a tantalizing little secret in the very first episode when Dan receives his instructions from the voice on the tape recording, and he says something to the extent of, "Welcome back, Dan. We hope this is permanent." So there's this idea that Dan was away from the Mission Impossible group for some period of time, and now he was back. So it's possible he retired. It's possible he did something else. I've seen one theory that there actually are multiple IMF teams, and that from there on in, we just don't see the adventures that he's involved in. But they never made any attempt to either explain his absence or any of the other actors who come in and out of the series during the course of its run. It was more or less par for the course back in those days on TV. Here today, gone tomorrow. The backstage story, as always, is much more interesting than what you actually saw on screen, especially since you got no explanation on screen.
So, give a little background about Peter Graves, the actor, and how he got the role, and what his character was, and.
Okay. Well, we'll start very briefly with the beginning again. Dan Briggs. Stephen Hill played Briggs as more of an organizer, a man who could be ruthless. The only time we ever see the mission leader kill someone personally who is not an actual risk to him is when Hill does it. He's also a master of psychology, and so a lot of the plans that he formed had a psychological basis of the effect that they would have on the week's villain. Hill, as an actor, also had a wonderful ability to be able to disappear into the background. He could dominate a scene, and sometimes he could disappear from the scene itself. It would seem that all of a sudden, even though he's still there, the emphasis shifts. Now that's good. It's excellent for an actor, but the problem is it's not necessarily what you want out of the lead actor, the team leader in the series. So you have Peter Graves. Well, Peter Graves is the brother of James Arness, who is the star of Gunsmoke. Like James Arness, he was from Minnesota, graduated from the University of Minnesota. He had appeared in the 50s in a lot of science fiction movies, the beginning of the end, Monsters from Space, different shows, different movies like that. He had graduated into a series of TV shows. Fury is one of them. Court Martial was another one of them. Shows that were not long-lived shows, but he was a recognizable face, if not a big star. What he brought to the series, and what they were looking for at the time that they cast him, was an everyman, someone who could be plausible, not only playing the mission leader, but also playing the other roles he would have to play in these various stings that they would set up. So he had to be somebody who could be an arrogant, officious state official, or a huckster, or a weak man, a gambler. He had to be able to play these different kinds of roles. He had to have the appearance, not just the physical appearance, but the kind of vibe that he set off that would be welcomed by the viewers. He had to have a certain warmth that viewers would like him. Stephen Hill was, by his conception of the role, a little cold, a little ruthless, a little difficult to perhaps get used to, although he was excellent in the role. But Graves went the other way and portrayed someone who was perhaps a little more easy for viewers to take. And he was extremely popular, both among the the actors, the producers, directors, the writers. He was very popular on the set, but he was also a hit with the viewers. And over the years, he became the constant figure on Mission Impossible, the actor who held the show together. So I think that as much as I enjoy that first season with Stephen Hill, I think the move to Peter Graves was a good move. I think it prolonged the length of the series, and I think it was a very successful change in, slight though it may have been, in the direction the show is taking.
Now, one of the characters that was most that stood out to me as a kid watching the show, and I was born in '65, so I remember around season 4 or 5, was the character of Barney, played by Greg Morris, because he was one of the few black actors in that day that had a regular series. There was the guy in the Mod Squad. There was Bill Cosby from I Spy.
Yeah.
And he played against the then stereotype of uneducated blacks. He was like a mechanical genius. He was the guy, Mr. Science. How did he get get hired? And what was the show actively looking for a black actor for the character or not?
They were not. They were looking for the best actor who could project the kind of aura that they wanted. And in that sense, Greg Morris had a couple of advantages. He was a very good actor, first of all, but perhaps even more important for this role, he was a man who was very comfortable with props. And as you mentioned, he's involved with a lot of gadgets, a lot of electrical equipment. His role in the series is that he is the owner of Collier Electronics, and so that's the expertise he brings to the show. But Greg Morris could do a lot of things with his hands. He was very comfortable working with props, with gadgets, and making it look like he had not only was comfortable doing that, but that he designed them himself. So from that standpoint, he was an excellent choice to play the role. As I say, he was also a very good actor, but his race really was not important to it. The casting director said that if he hadn't cast Greg Morris, he would have cast some handsome white blonde actor in the role. So the role never had any racial content, except maybe for a couple of episodes where they get into one episode where I think Barney's brother has been killed and the team is trying to avenge his death. And there's another one where Barney is involved in something with the ghetto, and there his race comes into play. But otherwise, it's never an issue, even to the point that he often plays a guard in these Eastern European dictatorships. And the question of how a black man gets to be a high-level guard in the military of an Eastern European dictatorship never seems to be an issue. And I think part of that is his skill as an actor, that you never thought about it. He was that good that you just accepted him instantly as Barney, and he projected that same level of warmth and competence that made you care about him as a character.
So then there's the husband and wife team of Barbara Bain and Martin Landau, real life husband and wife.
Mm-hmm.
The characters weren't married, were they? No.
No, they weren't. Although there was always some suggestion there might be a little electricity between the two of them.
Yeah, so Barbara Bain's character was called Cinnamon Carter, and Roland Hand was Martin Landau's character. Mm-hmm. So talk a little bit about both the actors and characters there.
Okay, we'll start with Cinnamon. She was a top fashion model and actress, and when you go through the scene at the beginning of each episode where the mission leader is going through his portfolio and looking at the various agents that he's going to need on this assignment, you always see Cinnamon pictured on this magazine cover as Model of the Year. And yet she's called on to portray an incredible range of roles, from drug addicts to loose women, to glamorous women, and it really gave Barbara Bain a chance to act. Up until then, she was primarily known as Martin Landau's wife. Martin Landau had a much higher profile than she did. He had been in a number of stage productions where he'd gotten great acclaim. He taught acting. He'd been in quite a few movies, usually as the heavy. He was playing, he was up there on Mount Rushmore in North by Northwest trying to throw Cary Grant off. So he was the better known of the two. But Barbara Bain won 3 Emmys for her performance in Mission Impossible, one for each of the seasons that she was on the show. And she was cool, calm, beautiful. My wife commented once as we were watching it that she was so beautiful that you questioned how on earth she could possibly get away with all these disguises. Mm-hmm. And the answer that I gave to that was that it was kind of like going to the grocery store and imagining that you ran into Cindy Crawford. You'd never buy it because Cindy Crawford isn't supposed to be at the corner Kroger's doing grocery shopping. So you might think that this beautiful woman here looks like she should be a supermodel, but you'd probably wind up saying to yourself, nah, that couldn't be. That's just not likely. But she is always cool, rarely gets rattled, wonderful member of the team. Rollin Hand, who is Martin Landau, is a master of disguise, a master of vocal impressions. He's an escape artist. He's a magician. And he goes by the title Man of a Million Faces. So whenever you need somebody to be impersonated, and there are a lot of impersonations in Mission Impossible, a lot of times when you have Landau pretending to be somebody else, he's perfect for that role. But he also brings, I think, something extra to it. He plays off of his reputation as a heavy in the movies, and Landau gives Rollin Hand an edge, a real edge to his character, that he's capable of anything. And you see him garrote somebody in the first season in a particular situation, and up until then you've only thought of him maybe as this makeup artist and vocal talent, somebody like a Frank Gorshin maybe who could really do something like that. And then you see this scene and you think to yourself, wow, this guy's actually a killer. You know, he's more than just an actor who they recruit from time to time. He's terrific. And so the two of them, I think, were indispensable to the success of the series. And when we see them leave the series, which we'll probably get into at some point, when you see them leave the series, you see a change in the tone of the series, and I think you see a change in the success of the series and the stories. They're still good, a lot of them, but the series is never the same after they leave.
Yeah, and for me, of the original, excepting for Graves, of the original cast, even as a kid, I didn't think much of the character of Willie the weightlifter. Who is that, and what role did that character play?
Okay, Willie Armitage, who is the world record holder in weightlifting, according to his dossier, is played by Peter Lupus, who I am proud to say is a native of Indiana, and he doesn't have a lot to do at various points in the series. He's the strong man. He's expected to be able to provide the muscle when it's needed, to be able to carry heavy things in. There's one episode, for instance, where he's supposed to carry a suitcase that has Wally Cox hidden in it, and he's able to do that. He's credible because he is that strong. But you're right, especially in the beginning, he doesn't have a lot to do. However, something that they don't make a big issue out of, but that is true from clues they drop during the course of the series, is that he's the head of the logistics for the for the team, when they need to have trucks, when they need to have logos on those trucks that are appropriate to the place, when they need to have uniforms or cars or anything where you're having a complicated setup that requires split-second timing, he's in charge of procuring all those things. So it is naturally something you're not going to see much of on the show itself, because you're walking into a situation where these things have already been taken care of. But that's the important role that he plays in the series. The other thing that Peter Lupus had going for him, and I keep talking about this, but in his case particularly, it's true. Viewers liked him immensely. There was something likable about him. He was big and strong, but he did not project the impression of being like the hired muscle that a mobster has along with him. Now, he could play that role, but he was very likable, got a big following. And later in the series, when they try to replace him with Sam Elliott as a doctor, and as you might consider, a doctor would be important on the team as well. But when they try to replace Peter Lupus with Sam Elliott, there's this tremendous outcry from viewers. They flood CBS and they flood Paramount with letters complaining about this, and they have to bring him back. And he thinks about it. He's rightfully offended that they were trying to replace him with somebody that they thought could give the series a different tenor. But he does come back, and the crew is happy, the cast is happy, and the viewers are happy. So even though he doesn't play as big a role as the other people in the show, he is one of the most popular members of the cast.
So let's just round out some of the later cast members and then talk about what a typical episode would be like and things like that. Now, probably the most well-known replacement character was Leonard Nimoy, coming off of Star Trek, and he played a character, and apparently, I didn't recall, but until I just looked it up earlier, a lot of the characters later on just only had a single name. He was known as Paris, and he was the Roland Hand replacement.
Correct.
And it's interesting because Nimoy in the 70s did a lot of interesting things. This was probably the first thing in the 70s that established him post-Spock from Star Trek. Probably the best role, I think, is the one he did in the 1978 Invasion of the Body Snatchers, where he was playing a cult-like kind of guy. But what was the reception of his character in replacing a popular character, and could he get out from being, oh, that's just Spock on the IMF?
Well, to set the stage for that, part of what had happened was, if we go back to when Martin Landau left the series, Martin Landau was never signed originally as a regular. He was scheduled to be on the show occasionally, and so he was never included in the opening credits. And unlike the other members of the cast, he was not on a long-term contract. He was on a season-to-season contract. And he grew in importance in the show because of the increasing problems that the show had with Stephen Hill. Stephen Hill was an Orthodox Jew, and he had it written into his contract that his workday ended at sundown on Friday. Now, Friday is usually the final workday of the week for a television show. So often, if you're going to be running long, Friday is going to be when that happens. Hill's refusal for religious grounds to work late created a vacuum in the series. There were often times when he just wasn't available to do as much work as he needed to do. And so that's how the Roland Hand character began to assume more importance in the series. By the second and third seasons, when Landau was a regular, he was on an equal billing with Peter Graves. It was also starring Peter Graves, starring Martin Landau, also starring the rest of them. But he was still on a season-to-season contract because he wanted the option to be able to work in movies. He left at the end of the third season in a contract dispute. There are different versions of it, whether he wanted more money or whether he wanted more flexibility. Barbara Bain left at the same time, either out of sympathy with her husband or out of misunderstandings over the contract, or because she also wanted more money. You can take your pick. The bottom line is both of them were off of the show. Now, where this comes into play with Leonard Nimoy is that the initial episodes where he plays Paris were originally Martin Landau written episodes. So he simply steps into the role. They change the names in there, but he does the same thing that Landau's character did as far as changing his appearance, changing his voice, doing some escape artistry, magic tricks, that kind of thing. He becomes the same character, only a different actor with a different name. And that's where Nimoy was most successful in the role, when he was playing the parts that were originally intended for Landau. As the season progresses, and we see this even more going into season 5, he has less and less to do in the show. To the point where in season 5, he really feels like he doesn't belong on the show at all, that he's just an afterthought. He is not disruptive. There's no trouble with the cast. There isn't anything like that. But he just feels that his character is becoming something of a cipher. And so he leaves after the 5th season. But the viewers enjoyed him. They didn't hold him a grudge for taking the place of the Roland Hand character of Martin Landau, but he never caught on. Even though people recognized him as Spock, they loved him because of that, but he never caught on with the viewers. And in fact, I think probably the one thing you can say that's most indicative of that is that in years to come, Nimoy would say that not once had an interviewer or a writer or a director or a fan ever asked him about his experiences on Mission Impossible or about anything that happened to him when he was playing that role. So as far as he was concerned, that was a footnote at best. He used to say that the first season he spent off of Mission Impossible, he did a couple of low-budget art house movies. He did a play that he'd been looking forward to being in. He was in The Man in the Glass Booth. He called it the best year of his acting life. And so particularly in the first season, his impact on the show was good, but they never developed the Paris character beyond those episodes where he was the replacement. And I think they could have, and I wish that they had, because he's an interesting actor, and that was an interesting role, but for whatever reason, it just doesn't work.
Yeah, it was as if Mr. Spock come down from outer space, and then Barbara Bain and Martin Landau went up to the moon.
Yes, they went to space 1999,
Yeah.
and he came from Star Trek, and he had hoped to be able to develop his character, that he could break out of that Spock mold and do something really interesting with Paris. And I think he would have, but it just didn't work.
I remember he wrote a bio in the 70s, I am not Spock, and then like 20 years later he wrote, I am Spock.
I am Spock, yeah.
But now the rest of the characters that were even less, I think, consequential than the Paris character. I mean, Leslie Ann Warren and Linda Day George, they were nice to look at, but their characters they didn't have the joie de vivre that Barbara Bain's character had. You mentioned Sam Elliott as a doctor. I don't even remember him, quite frankly. And then there's someone, Barbara Anderson, who I guess was the babe of the hour for the last couple of seasons, that, again, I don't remember them. So talk a little bit about these sort of lesser-known characters.
Sure. Well, Leslie Ann Warren, who at the time was going by the name Leslie Warren, was the replacement for Barbara Bain in season 5. You notice that I didn't say season 4. There was no replacement for her in season 4. They went with a series of guest stars. The most often used was Lee Meriwether. And she played a character named Tracy, I think in a half a dozen episodes. And they had high hopes. The cast in particular really wanted to see Lee Meriwether become the new member of the team. She brought a sophistication and a class and a gravitas to the role that they thought was essential for replacing Bane. However, you have Leslie Ann Warren instead, who, even though she was only 2 or 3 years younger than Linda Day George, who winds up replacing her. Even though she was only a couple of years younger, she, as somebody pointed out, was still at an age where she was able to pass for roles where she was 16 or 17. And she was very shapely, but she was very wooden in this role. She was never able to figure it out. She didn't meld well as a character with the rest of the cast at all. She didn't have a real sense of humor about it. She was so intense and so intent on wanting to do something, and the ideas that she did have for the role were not at all in conjunction with what the showrunners wanted to do. So she came across just as somebody who was too young and immature to play that role. And yeah, she has a couple of highlights, but by and large, she's the worst part of probably the worst season of the show. She's replaced at the end of that one season, not by Lee Meriwether, but by Linda Day George. And she plays this character called Casey. And Casey is an interesting character because she is meant actually to replace both Barbara Bain and Martin Landau. She is the femme of the equation, and she's very good in that role, but she's also a makeup artist, and so she is responsible for different disguises and different illusions that they're going to pull off, where she can use her expertise. She is a much better choice for the role. She does fit in with the cast. She's not Barbara Bain, but she is a credible member of the team, and I think that's good. Now, in the final season, season 7, she is out on maternity leave. And so for part of the time, they're able to cover that up by having her appear at the start of the show, putting her in a mask or something where she isn't going to be visible as Linda Day George during the episode. So they're able to get away with it for a little while there. But what they do, which is actually kind of interesting, they take Barbara Anderson, who had been on Ironside. She had been the first policewoman to work on Raymond Burr's team on Ironside. And she is the only character in the Mission Impossible series that is actually given anything approaching an origin story. She plays a role in an episode where she is coming out of a bad situation. She is recruited by the team to help them out in the case that they're working on. And at the end of that episode, they ask her if she can continue to help them from time to time, and she agrees. And so she winds up in maybe 7, 8 episodes in the final season. She winds up being the principal replacement for Linda Day George when she's out on maternity. They'd originally thought of having some rotating guests, but she winds up being more or less the permanent replacement while that happens. And as you mentioned, she doesn't make a real impact, but on the other hand, she does what she does in those well. She projects a vulnerability that isn't always there in the series. And for the kinds of assignments they were putting her on, that worked pretty well. So, and they explained it away. Again, the only time they ever explain a character's absence, they explained it away by saying that Casey, George's character, was off in Europe on a special assignment. So that throwaway line also is the only clue we ever get that there may be more than one team out there doing these kinds of things. So she's gone. The last person we'd look at would be Sam Elliott. And he's in, I think, a half dozen episodes. And he plays a character named Dr. Doug Robert. They must have been into some kind of idea of having two first names. It could just as easily have been Dr. Robert Doug. He was very young at that point in time. He's just starting to make an impact as a named actor rather than an unnamed extra. And he's good in this. There are really a couple of problems with his character. One is that while it seems to be a good idea to have a doctor on the team, as I mentioned earlier, they had survived for most of 5 seasons without having a doctor on the team. Whenever they needed one, they would simply bring somebody in as one of their guest stars that could perform the medical functions. And most of the time, they simply explained it away by having Barney talk about it. Yes, Jim, we've got this special pill or this special stinger in this ring that when they shake hands, it'll knock them out. So they'd already explained why they didn't have a doctor on the team. The bigger problem was something that Sam Elliott could do nothing about. The problem was that he wasn't Peter Lupus. And so he became the brunt of the objections to Lupus not being in the series. Even though, interestingly enough, Lupus and Elliott were actually in 3 episodes together, where they're all part of the team. But the thought by Bruce Lansbury, who had by now succeeded Bruce Geller as the executive producer, they were hoping to get a slightly younger audience, trying to inject something new into the series. It didn't work. And so he does one episode. He appears in the first episode of season 6, which actually had been filmed with the rest of them for season 5. So he appears in that handful of episodes at the end of season 5. He's gone. So by this time, you've got 3 actors who have been on the series for the bulk of it. You have Peter Graves, who's been in every season but one. You have Greg Morris, who is the only actor who appears in the opening credits for every episode. And you have Peter Lupus, who did not appear in the opening credits for those episodes that he wasn't in, but is with the series from beginning to end.
So, one of the things about the show, because it's episodic television, because it was very much a format show, it's almost, looking at it from an artistic perspective as a critic, it's sort of like if you were sort of slightly changing, say, if you're watching a play, and you put in a character or one actor, the backup actor takes the role, and I think of all the shows we've talked about thus far as being great watches, this is probably the one where I think a lot of people would give a lot of pushback to, or some pushback, because while I think the first 3 or 4 seasons were really the classic MI, which is the opposite of Star Trek, which often started there. The later shows started off slow the first few years before they hit their stride. The show suffered from, I think, a lot of that excess turnover, and also from a lot of the repetitive kind of storylines. I mean, you had storylines, there were Nazis, then there's the overthrowing of the dictator kind of shows, there's the commies are always, hovering in the background. But for me, even as a kid, I know my dad didn't like Mission Impossible because especially during the Vietnam War, this show was sort of going against the grain, still trying to show Americans being the good guys, when even when we're watching them, they fit sort of the ugly American stereotype that came about there. So was IMF really the bad guys?
It's a very good question, and it was a question that was being asked at the time as well. There was one producer who actually had refused to work on the show because he found the concept morally offensive. He did wind up working on it, but he turned down Geller's request to become the first producer of the show for precisely that reason. And there were critics who voiced some real concerns about this, because you were showing a government agency that was becoming increasingly involved in the domestic affairs of foreign countries, many of whom we had friendly relations with, where we were trying to manipulate the outcome of elections, or we were trying to eliminate certain members of the government who we felt were working against American interests, or who were doing various other things that we said were harmful to the future of that country. Now, it's easy to say that you might not want to have Che Guevara involved in Cuba because the man is a butcher. But if you look at the actual historical situation in Cuba, there are going to be people who say, yes, but was Batista really that much better than Che or Castro? And that's the point. It portrays the United States government as making a value judgment on behalf of the citizens of a sovereign, independent country. You're going to be better off because of what we are doing for you. So there's a little bit of that great white father vibe to it. But
and then we also, 1972, when the last season started, that was when the overthrow of the Chilean leader,
Yep.
and they installed Allende, the CIA. So it was almost like real life mimicking television.
Exactly. And what you'd seen as they got closer to the end of the series, the last couple of seasons in particular, you saw more of an emphasis on domestic crime, the syndicate, which I love. You can see somebody at the Bureau of Motor Vehicles, and when it comes time to list occupation or employer, you put down the syndicate. But they started to get involved more in these domestic situations. Part of that was a result of the Church Committee in Washington looking at the involvement of the United States, of the CIA in foreign affairs and interference with international politics. So they were trying to get away from that vibe a bit. And as I mentioned earlier, they were also trying to bring down the costs on the series because it was one of the most expensive shows in the history of television at that point. And by being able to do location shooting in the United States, it saved some money from all of these elaborate sets that they had to build. So there were a couple of good reasons for going to domestic crime. But the political situation was a big one. And that created a few problems of its own because besides the geopolitical question, there's a real moral component to Mission Impossible. And although I'm a big fan of the show, especially those first 3 or 4 seasons, when I think it's probably one of the most intelligent and best written shows on television, it's often excellent, but even if it's not excellent, it's usually very, very good. But there is this moral component, and you find yourself asking, is it right to frame somebody? He might be a bad guy, but is it right morally to frame him for a crime he didn't commit because you don't have the evidence to convict him on a crime he did commit? Is it right to lead certain people to believe a lie is the truth? Is it right to gain evidence illegally in order to try to get a conviction of a syndicate member? And that's the key question I pose in the last couple of seasons, because frequently when the IMF team is called in on a syndicate-related crime, it's specifically because the government can't legally obtain the evidence that they need in order to secure a conviction. So your job is to obtain the evidence by whatever means possible, but to give your obtaining of the evidence a plausible deniability so that the evidence can be used. In the case of international foreign situations, you're seeing what are essentially assassinations being pulled off. You're seeing murders being committed, not by the force, but by setting up a situation so that the members turn against each other. drug kingpin, his associates think that he's trying to run off with the profits, they kill him. Well, see, IMF doesn't have anything to do with that. We didn't kill him. So there again, you have that plausible deniability. So your question about whether or not they are the good guys is a very nuanced one. The way I would answer it is, yes, they are working for what is probably in the United States' best interest, or domestically working in the best interests of law enforcement. But the question that is never asked on the show is, do the ends justify the means? Clearly, in the world of Mission Impossible, they do. You get the conviction how by whatever means possible, you influence this other country's foreign policy by whatever means possible. And as I've grown older, that started to trouble me more and more, because you do see, you mentioned Black Ops at the beginning, you do start to think about the show this way, and you see them starting to rig elections and starting to trample on civil liberties and civil rights, and you find yourself asking, is this really right? Now, the advantage of the show is that it has, as I said, very likable characters, very literate and intelligent scripts, and very fast action, so that you don't really notice a lot of the logical gaps in the plot. And if you're going to watch the show and enjoy it, you're simply going to have to say to yourself, accept it for what it is. If you're going to write a scholarly work on whether it is in a way one of the most subversive shows that's ever been on television, and one that puts the government in potentially a more negative light than any other one, you're going to have a fascinating time doing that, because it's going to be very interesting. But it's going to depend on how you look at it. If you're looking at it for entertainment, the moral questions are always going to be on the back burner. If you're looking at it for those moral questions, the entertainment value is always going to be on the back burner. I know that was kind of a sloppy answer, but it really is an important, prescient point to be making, I think.
Let's pause here at 25 minutes and we'll do. So, before we talk about sort of why it was canceled and the legacy of the show, we've talked a few times in the last handful of shows that we've done about episodic television and how everything these days seems to be serialized.
Mm-hmm.
And this is a show that I think could make a good argument either way. On the one hand, it was very episodic. You said there were a few shows like Barney and his brother, and characters go off. Some baddie has a personal grudge against one of the characters, and so that they're working sort of pro bono just to keep themselves intact. But I'm wondering if a show like this, where we don't get any of the background, if a show like this is almost too episodic in a sense, because while I think like the Hill Street Blues was, I think, the show that started this whole trend of, oh, we're going to see his bare ass, or we're going to see the characters coming out of the toilet, or whatever it might be. This show, I think, makes a good argument for it's very tight, it's very clipped. There's little fat, at least in the first 3 or 4 seasons. There's little fat that needs to be cut out. We're basically given not a police procedural, but an intelligence procedural of how to do something. So do you think that the show could have benefited if we had found out about, Cinnamon Carter's first true love, or, Greg Morris's characters, his brother suffering from some terminal disease or something?
Yeah, I'm a little partial when it comes to something like this, because I tend not to like the soap opera elements of any series. And by soap opera, I'm just using that as shorthand to talk about bringing all of these personal details in there. Some people think of that as fleshing out the characters. I think of it more as introducing a soap opera element. I don't think that it worked the few times they did try it on Mission Impossible, and I don't think it was supposed to work. One of the things that Bruce Geller was adamant about when he created the show was that it would not go into the private lives of its characters. It was all mission driven. And so, as we talked about having the sparse dialogue, we also had sparse histories of these characters. They were there to function to advance the script and advance the story. And so he didn't want to have these extracurricular elements involved. And I think that that works to the show's benefit because it really appeals to the viewer who wants to see the puzzle assembled, wants to see how they're going to get this mission accomplished. It calls back the best parts of Columbo in the sense that Columbo was this literate, how-done-it type of show. So was Mission Impossible, and I think that the handful of times they brought the characters' personal lives into the episode, those episodes did not work as well. The only time they ever did two-part stories, and they actually did one that was even a three-part story, but you're right, they didn't do it very often. When they did do it, it was because of the complexity of the story itself, that the scam they were going to pull, the plot that they were going to pull off was so complicated that you couldn't properly set it up and explain it during the course of one episode. You had to expand it into two, and that makes sense because Geller's aspiration really was to work in motion pictures. So he had a big vision idea of what stories could be like, and a complicated story was not something that would scare him off. But as far as the personal aspects of it, and I agree with him, I don't think that works.
It reminds me of 15, 20 years ago, someone got the bright idea, one of the major publishing houses, to hire someone to write out a novel about Captain Ahab's wife. As if we really needed to know that, as if that was somehow coded into the Moby Dick universe.
Yeah, you don't need, not everybody needs an origin story, and these people, your previous question had been about whether or not they're the good guys. What they are heroes in the sense that we're rooting for them. That the bad guys, I think, the bad guys were always meant to be very bad, very unsympathetic, so that you would not start to ask questions about whether or not they were the good guys. And it's the same going into this. You don't want to see weaknesses. You don't want to see anything that suggests anything that happened to them in the past that starts to look like baggage, that starts to look like something that they carry with them into the job. We don't need to know those kinds of things.
We don't need to know if Peter Graves was molested as an 8-year-old. You know, it's
precisely.
Or I should say Jim Phelps' character. But you mentioned Columbo, and it's interesting because Columbo, especially the golden years of the 70s, as we had mentioned, was not a whodunit, but a how did it, and we open that episode. All those episodes basically open with we see the bad guy doing the crime and then covering it up, and how is Columbo going to get there? Here, we know there's a bad thing, and the machinations come in the middle of each episode where the IMF is responding, and here's how we're going to get them. The bad guys don't know it, but we know it, and how are the bad guys going to fall into it? I don't remember. Were there any episodes where the bad guys got away with the stuff, or were they always beaten?
No, they were always defeated at the end. As I recall, the most ambiguous ending that they ever had was one where they had two crime lords. I don't remember if they were in the syndicate or if they were foreign dictators, but the point is you had two bad guys in there, and at the end of the episode they have manipulated events around the IMF team to where one of them is going to off the other one, and you hear the gunshot at the end, so you know someone has killed someone else, but you never find out which one killed which one. And presumably the one that survived was going to be taken care of by others anyway, but that's the closest they really came to an ambiguous finish.
Now, looking at the series, it was never a super blockbuster. It was a moderate hit. You know, the Nielsen's, I guess, the highest it got was to maybe in the 30s to the 40s. So it was in the middle of the pack. Uh, what was the thing that caused them to finally cancel it? Because
Well, it was decreasing in popularity. It had been in its first couple of seasons. It had been quite popular, and it especially appealed to an older demographic. Now, we know what's going on with CBS during the rural purge, and it's not necessarily a good thing to have an older demographic. That accounts for some of the attempts that they made to appeal to a younger audience, attempts which, as we've seen, were not particularly successful. But I think you could say that the proximate cause of Mission Impossible leaving the air was its expense. It was even when they were shooting on location, it was still an incredibly expensive show to make. It was, especially in the years when Bruce Geller was running it, always over budget. And not just for the entire season, but for almost every episode. And it was perennially driving the bean counters at Paramount crazy. Now, they weren't driving the people at CBS crazy. However, CBS loved the show, and they would probably have liked to have seen it continue. But the most practical explanation for why the show finally ended was because Paramount, the producer of the show, Paramount could make more money syndicating the show than they could making new episodes of it. So it finally came down to a bottom line. But as we have suggested, as you mentioned before, they were also running out of plots. And there were maybe 3 or 4 basic plots to the series, and everything else was a variation on that. And it was getting harder and harder to come up with original ideas that still fell into this very specialized, systematic way that the show was being written. So it reached nobody would have been surprised to see it continue for another season, but I think by that time it had reached the natural end of its life.
the last episode, I would assume then there was no big send-off. They didn't.
No,
No.
no, they're nothing different. You don't really learn. You don't learn anything. Um, when the show is revived in the '80s on ABC for a couple of seasons. That's done in part, if I'm recalling correctly, it's partly done because of the writers' strike that was going on at the time, because they were able to recycle some old plots from the original Mission Impossible and to redo them. There had been some talk of bringing the series back from time to time with the original cast. But in the end, when they did bring it back for a couple of seasons, it was only with Peter Graves as Jim Phelps, although you actually had Greg Morris's son playing Barney's son. And Greg Morris makes a cameo appearance in the revived series, which again is a reworking of a previous episode they had done on the original series. There's mention made of Casey, Linda Day George's character. They refer to her as Lisa Casey. It's the only time we ever found out what her first name actually was. It isn't mentioned in the original run of the series, but otherwise things are pretty much as mysterious as they ever were.
Yeah, before you mentioned, I had even forgotten that there had been a show in the mid '80s. I know they revived Get Smart. I think in the late '90s. But they did a feature film of Get Smart. I think it was like The Naked Bomb, and then they tried to make it a series or something like that. Yeah, it was pretty forgettable. The revival, but. Since that was set in the same universe, I've never watched the Tom Cruise films. I've seen, 5-10 minute clips that people over the years have shown me, a handful of whatnot. Is that set in the same original universe or
yeah,
not?
it is, but there's a problem that many people have with the first movie, which is going to color how you look at the rest of the series of movies. Tom Cruise does not play Jim Phelps. He plays a member of the team, the star member of the team. In the first movie, um, John Voight actually plays Jim Phelps, plays him by name. And at the end of the movie, spoiler alert, it turns out that Jim Phelps is a traitor. That he has sold out his country because he got tired of seeing everybody else make the big money that he never got. Now, so we are dealing with the same universe in the sense that Jim Phelps was the head of Mission Impossible. But the idea that Jim Phelps would ever sell his country out for anything is so wildly absurd. Peter Graves was offended by it, refused to have anything to do with it. It actually, as it had been written, they were going to have Greg Morris appear in the movie. I can't remember if he was going to appear as Barney or not, but Greg Morris was going to be in the movie. When he found out that they were turning Phelps's character into a traitor, he refused to have anything to do with it. And Phelps himself, John Voight, could be anybody. You know, he resembles Jim Phelps because he's got white hair. But he could have been anybody. There was no reason at all for Brian De Palma to turn the head of the mission leader, into Jim Phelps. He could have named him Sonny Bono for all that it would have concerned. So if you take the movie and the series of movies on their own, if you pretend that it is a different universe and that it's a different Mission Impossible team and that Jim Phelps was never mentioned by name at all in this, then it probably works pretty well. But it's an action-adventure series, and the TV series was an espionage adventure puzzle, but not an action series. So you could have called it anything. They were really, I think, going off of the IP that Mission Impossible had, but it doesn't bear any real resemblance to the original series, except maybe in the idea that they're getting involved in these kinds of assignments. I thought that the first movie was entertaining enough, but when they dropped the Phelps as a traitor bomb at the end of it, I just thought, I'm out of here. I'm not going to watch any of these other movies. So I haven't had.
Well, I'm not a big Tom Cruise fan anyway. But so let's get back then to the series and just sort of wrap things up. What would be say 2 or 3 sort of episodes that you would recommend someone who's never watched the television show, maybe only knows the Cruise movies? Give me 2 or 3 episodes that you think are the most classic that should be, watched.
I would say that you're going to want to look on the first 3 seasons when you have the original supporting cast, including Barbara Bain and Martin Landau. You'll want to check out a first season series because you're going to want to see how different the tone of the series can be when you have Stephen Hill in the lead. And in that sense, almost any episode from the first season will work. Odds on Evil is a good episode. It has Nehemiah Persoff as not a dictator, but an absolute ruler of a foreign country who is looking to buy weapons from an illegal arms dealer in order to give his country superiority over the neighboring countries. Now, in a sane universe, there are 2 ways you would handle this. This is a big gambling country, by the way. Think Monaco, but think Monaco as if the prince had ideas on world domination. That's the way you've got to play with it. But he's going to fund all these arms deals with cash that he's funneled out of the casinos. So in a sane world, you'd do one of 2 things. You'd either assassinate him or you'd steal his money. But this being Mission Impossible, what they decide to do is rig the games at the casino so that he winds up spending all the money that he was saving for these arms deals. He spends and loses the money at the table. it's enormously entertaining. It's an intricate plot, and it gives you a really good idea of how the series operates, how they come up with these very baroque, very oblique ways of doing things. And it is a prime example of one of the things that Bruce Geller said in creating the series, which was, you can't cheat an honest man. That's one of the reasons why we never get hung up in the course of the series wondering whether what they're doing is moral or ethical or not. It's because the bad guys are bad guys. And if they're greedy, they're going to be greedier. If they want regional domination, they're going to want world domination. You exploit those weaknesses. And in this case, you exploit the weakness of Nehemiah Persoff, who is both greedy and arrogant. And he doesn't want to lose, and so he makes foolish decisions and blows the money, and the arms deal falls through. They exploit those weaknesses, and that's a really good example of how the Dan Briggs version of Mission Impossible works. If you go further on, there's an episode in the second season called The Seal. And I really like that one because it shows how flexible and how ingenious this series is. You've got this rich businessman, Darren McGavin, and he owns this jewel that is considered sacred by the country from which the jewel comes. And in order to appease this country, with whom the United States wants to have very good relations, the team is assigned to steal the jewel and return it to its rightful owners. Never mind the fact that McGavin legally bought it. It shouldn't have been on the market in the first place, so we're going to steal it from him. And it's a high security building. There's no possible way that they can do this. So what they did was they recruited, they brought in an orange cat named Orangey, who is actually one of the most famous cat actors in Hollywood. And the cat plays a vital role in going through this very small entrance, walking along this very narrow walkway, and opening the door to get the jewel out of the case without setting off any of the alarms, and then to come back. And so, whether I like it because I like cats, but I recommend it because it shows just how ingenious their plans can be. There's a pair of episodes that I'll just mention really quickly. One of them is called The Execution. And it's a very interesting story because in order to get the bad guy's right-hand man to squeal on the bad guy, provide them with the information they need to convict him, they get him to believe through their scam that time has passed, that he's been convicted of a crime, sentenced to death, and is about to be executed, but that the warden will give him a full commutation of his death sentence to life in prison if he agrees to turn state's evidence. It's a chilling episode because it shows them taking him all the way from the cell with the priest giving him the last rites to going down the long walk to the death chamber. They open up the gas chamber, they lock him in, they strap him in, they're getting ready to drop the pellet into the container to release the cyanide that's going to execute him. They keep telling him, the governor is right here on the phone, but you've got to talk. It's a very powerful anti-capital punishment argument, and it is one of the few times, I think, in the series when the action is deliberate enough and cruel and harsh enough that you really can ask yourself, is this moral what they're doing? Making this man think that he is going to be executed in a matter of seconds if he doesn't cooperate. It's brutal. It's on the verge of torture. And the fact that he's a bad guy and his employer is a bad guy doesn't change that fact. So if you want to consider the ethics of that, that's an excellent episode to look at. The final episode I'm going to recommend is one from later on during the Leonard Nimoy run of the series. It's called The Innocent. And you have, I believe, it's Barney who has been caught, and they need to find some way to spring him, and they're recruiting this person who is an expert in his field. He's played by Christopher Connolly, and he refuses to have anything to do with them because he doesn't approve of the U.S. government engaging in covert activities with foreign countries. So no, I won't help you get this. And so what happens is Paris, Leonard Nimoy, plants heroin in Christopher Connolly's girlfriend's room so that they can bust her, and they can then tell him, we'll get your girlfriend off, we'll drop all the charges if you help us with this mission. And so that's another one of those morally compromised episodes that shows the lengths to which they will go to get one of their own out. So there, I guess you've said I've offered two that are just exciting, that give you an idea of how the series works. I've offered two that are very entertaining, but that are going to be more problematic when it comes to what you think the moral of the story is. But in between, especially in those first 3 seasons, if you want to see them going up against neo-Nazis or drug runners or people money laundering, anything like that, there are going to be some fine episodes in there. You could pick almost any episode from those 3 seasons and be entertained by it.
So just to wrap up then, if you could just continue on in that vein, why would you say that this is a great television show of a newbie to watch?
I would say that it is great because it is very smart. When it was on television, it was widely considered the smartest program on television. It's very smart. The plots are very intricate. They always keep the viewer guessing. Invariably, there are a couple of times when an act concludes in the series and it looks like somebody has been caught, uncovered. When you come back from the commercial break, you find out that that was the way it was supposed to look. You were supposed to think that Barney had been caught, but in reality, that's part of the very plan. It plays into what they wanted to do. So they're all very smart, and it's well acted, it's well written, it's exciting, and if you're the logical kind of person who likes to nitpick at various plot holes, you're not going to have time to do it because it moves so fast. So that's the kind of entertainment it's providing. I recommend it with reservations because if you think about the moral implications of it, either the personal morality that's involved in the decision making or the diplomatic morality of what they do with other countries, you're going to be bothered by that. And you've got to turn that part of your brain off if you're going to truly enjoy the series for what it is. So I guess I would say if that's really going to bother you, this probably isn't going to work as a series because you're either going to root. You're not going to be able to root against them because the bad guys are so bad, but at the same time, you're going to keep saying to yourself, they're stomping on all of these civil rights and Universal Declaration of Human Rights and all these kinds of things, and you're going to find it hard to root for them too. So I think you're going to get bogged down in the details on it. So, but if you can set that aside, I think you will really enjoy the adventure and the action and the smartness of the series.
Well, to be fair, even a show like Star Trek that has aims for high morals, they've had main characters be genocidal.
But you remember how slippery the Prime Directive is. That only works if it's a plot point. If the Prime Directive doesn't advance the plot point, Kirk's happy to go in there and interfere in the affairs of other.
But Cisco and Janeway would probably be on war crime tribunals.
and I don't want to put too fine a point on that because I think that there's a tendency we have to get altogether too political when we're watching entertaining shows on television. The point should never be thought of that Mission Impossible is acting intentionally as a rah-rah political story for the booster for the government. It's never trying to make an ideological point. What it's trying to do is make an entertainment point that fits into a plausible Cold War scenario, but it isn't trying to make that point. So I don't want anybody to think that it is an ideologically driven show, because I don't think it is. But if you are touchy about that kind of thing, you might be touchy about this. Best way of doing it, try out a couple of episodes and see what you think.
Well, I will link to the It's About TV blog, and hopefully we'll be back here soon talking about another show. Thanks again, Mitch, for
Love it.
talking about it.
Thanks, Dan.